Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our speaker today is Mr. Apoorv Kabir Gupta, who is a Sustainability Strategy Manager and manages the Global United Nations client accounts at Accenture UK. He is also the Secretary, Board of Directors of World Information Transfer. His expertise lies in developing technology for good partnerships, CO research of sustainability, and identifying net zero pathways for more than 90% of the Fortune 500 companies. So over to you, Kabir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach, as well as Jessica, for organizing this Virtual Voices series. It's always a pleasure to host some of these and also be a speaker once in a while. The topic that I'm going to be talking about today is, Dr. Durbach, a very, very important topic that touches the lives of almost everyone, not only on this call, but also around this world. And it is the topic of misinformation and fake news. With the number of new news channels now open around the world, the proliferation of information has just exponentially increased. Take these statistics, for example. 1.8 billion is the number of fake news engagements that take place on Facebook every 3 months. 35% of millennials, and these are individuals who were born after the 1980s, people who are well in their mid-30s, joining government, influential organization, companies, etc. 35% of these people rely on Facebook to read any kind of political news. 52% of Americans say they regularly encounter fake news daily in their lives every single day. And in 2020, only 20% of citizens around the world said they trust media outlets because of the proliferation of fake news. Now, fake news is an extremely important topic because it is the way information, knowledge, and awareness is shared. And because of that medium, decisions are based on that information, that awareness. Political campaigns are set. And when fake news grips an entire population, and when fake news has mass control over some of the most impressionable minds around the world, it can lead to disastrous outcomes. Climate change is one of those topic areas that has impacted fake news, and fake news impacting climate action. Before I dive into how fake news is actually impacting the climate change debate, I want to talk about just climate and misinformation doing harm since the 1850s. The 1850s is when people and populations actually realized that burning fossil fuels was harmful to the planet. It releases more carbon dioxide and produces a greenhouse gas effect. We have known that fossil fuels are bad for the environment and lead to climate change for over 150 years. For 150 years, the scientific community has understood the mechanisms of climate science. In fact, even during the Cold War, up until the 1980s, scientific research focused on the impact that atomic bombs and weapons were having on the atmosphere. And that research as a byproduct included a lot of findings and understanding of the impact that carbon dioxide and methane were having and being stored in our atmosphere, and the result that they were having on climate change. So there is a lot of research since the past 150 years that we have known on climate change. But what is happening today? Today is 2022. But even today, climate change remains a controversial topic. Even today, 150 years later, many politicians, governments, and even citizens, as well as students, are not debating about taking the right political or moral action, but they are debating on whether science is accurate or not on climate change. And that, in a large impact, is to do with fake information. Through World Information Transfer, a delegation went and attended the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conferences, the COP26 climate conferences. I happen to be leading that delegation, as Dr. Tabak, you know. The main topic of debate amongst the global north and the global south was the accuracy of the science. Despite two very influential IPCC reports coming out and explaining in no uncertain terms that humans were responsible for climate change, we were at a mega conference debating whether the science was accurate or not, and whether the actions can be tweaked based on the time period that the IPCC has given us, namely 2030 and 2050. That was not a conference to debate the accuracy of scientific evidence. That was a conference to take action based on the scientific evidence. So why is there so much misinformation 150 years later still? When we understand climate science, we understand the dynamics of the atmosphere, and we understand our role in climate change. And a large part to do with that is actually the proliferation of fake news and the amount of fake news on climate change that spreads around the world. In fact, research from Arizona State University has shown that even a brief exposure to fake news in a reader's mind can actually change their opinion on climate change and change their belief and dilute their activism, and sort of, cast a doubt on the scientific consensus that we have on climate change. And that is just 15 minutes of exposure to fake news on climate change. So that is the kind of impact, the psychological impact that misinformation can have. Let's take a few examples. Sorry, did I hear a question over there, Jessica?
No.
So one of the examples was last year, there was an art. Go ahead, Dr. Dobak. Were you about to say anything?
No.
Last year, one article had 4.2 million impressions around the world. 4.2 million people read one single article, shared it on Facebook multiple times. It was located on a website called Natural News, which is a known conspiracy associated website around climate change. And the title of the article was, NASA admits that climate change occurs because of changes in the Earth's solar orbit and not because of SUVs or fossil fuels. That article, which is completely debunked since by Forbes, by the BBC Fact Checker, by Fast Company, that article was circulated 4.2 million times around the world. There is an insatiable appetite for fake news, for conspiracy theories, for misinformation. These articles are designed as clickbait. They have urgent sounding, exploratory, investigative titles. And because of the proliferation of social media and websites emerging, which look like news websites in design, in terms of formatting, that it's very easy to spread misinformation around the world. Now, the misinformation spreads far and wide. But when corrections are made on that misinformation, people don't share it further. In fact, this is a trend that continues the cycle of misinformation around the world. One company will post an article based on a catchy title, wrong information, no factual checking, no resources to back up the evidence. That article will spread on social media around the world, much like the one that I just described did, 4.2 million times. And then institutions like the BBC, established journalistic organizations, credible organizations will fact check that article and prompt it to issue a correction on their evidence. They will maybe include a small little note at the bottom of the article saying, note, this article is not independently verifiable, or the evidence in this article remains doubtful. That is the kind of correction. But that correction is not shared 4.2 million times to all the people who have read it. In fact, it's shared less than 0.02% of the times. Nobody who actually even engages with fake news decides to curb it in its tracks and forward share any of the corrections that come about, which is why the misinformation war has been so rampant around the world, and it's impacting people's perspectives, people's action, and people's understanding of climate change. And that translates not only at the individual level, it translates at the regional level, it translates at the national level, and then so forth on the international level as well. If people continue to still debating, Dr. Durbach, whether the science is correct behind climate change or not, we won't see the level of activism emerge from grassroots, emerge at the regional level, that will push delegations that we see at the United Nations conferences to actually take stronger action on climate change. In addition to misinformation that spreads through sort of quasi-news agencies, you also have misinformation that spreads through institutions. So interest-based groups, such as those aligning with oil and gas companies, or even sort of oil-producing nations, will release reports based on very loose scientific research, and that will become the main sort of evidence points for these additional news websites to create and write articles about that. In fact, there was a recent projection that was released by the oil-producing nations, saying that oil production is actually poised to increase on a year-by-year basis right up till 2050. And that's a completely different finding as opposed to what the UN IEA or the World Bank or the IPCC report is calling out, or even the Secretary General, who says that oil production must steeply decline not only by 2050, but also by 2030. But what these interest groups and the publications that are produced by these interest groups do is that they help the mobilization of finances into such projects, and misinformation carries far and wide, and also helps people believe and understand that this is not a declining industry, for instance, oil production. And so we can really try and see and understand that the genesis of fake news is much more complex in the world today. It's not as easy because it doesn't sound so bizarre. It doesn't sound different to how we read news articles. It is released on platforms which very much look like news articles. It contains language, how journalists write, right? Like Jessica, you have exposure in the media world. You must have seen an incredible amount of proliferation of multiple Instagram accounts which poise to be sort of news outlets, and they repurpose titles, not even full articles. And that sort of, with the kind of attention span that millennial populations have on these platforms, 30 seconds, you read a news title and you feel like you read the article and you scroll further. And that's the biggest problem as well. The other problem is debates. And sometimes debates are factually incorrect and not needed. So let's take another example. At the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, the world was shocked by the raging Australian bushfires. I'm sure everyone would have read articles about the number of species that died in the Australian bushfires, the number of days that it went on for, the amount of public resources and efficiency that was required to douse the bushfires. And that stirred up a large debate on the fact that forest fires was an inevitable consequence of climate change. In fact, according to the United Nations, forest fires would increase by 4 times annually. We would see 4 times as many forest fires as we have been seeing in recent times in Canada, in the United States, in Australia. Forest fires are poised to increase by 4 times up until 2030. So there is a high likelihood that even by 2030, we might not even have any forest left because they're all burned, at least in the equatorial region. So this stirred a big debate around climate change, that the forest fires that took place in Australia were actually a direct and inevitable result of a warming planet. However, beyond the media covering just the stories of political bravery, as well as sort of like the support work of multiple organizations, as well as climate change being the main cause of the fire in Australia, the main debate that came to light was from people who were very fast and quick on social media to not say that this was caused by climate change, but to say that the forest fires were actually caused by arson that was present in the forests. And that because of the arson, Australia was raging under flames. And this debate spread so fast on social media that it actually began confusing a lot of individuals. In fact, 23,000 people on one given day were discussing and debating whether the forest fires in Australia were caused by arson or whether they're caused by climate change on Instagram's live video feature. 23,000 at the same time were taking place debating this issue. Another debate erupted that the forest fire was actually caused by fireflies, which I just completely denounce, because fireflies don't actually have fire in them. They're just called fireflies because they light up at night. But you can see, you can understand my point that events take place in the world which are very closely tied to climate change, but then we dilute those stories with misinformation, with fake information, and that gets spread around the world. It goes sensational, it goes viral, it has elements of conspiracy, it offers an alternative argument, it might speak to the psychology of individuals not wanting to understand some complex dynamics such as climate change. But eventually what this debate, whereas the Australian wildfires took place, was these misleading stats made it into a UK House of Commons speech that was later corrected by The Guardian, saying the claims that arson is primary cause of the season's bushfires in Australia have been completely debunked. Fire officers report that the majority of blazes were started by dry lightning storms. Nevertheless, social media is awash with false claims and the role of arson obscuring the link between climate change and bushfires. This was the official Guardian correction made after even the hint of arson being responsible for the forest fires made it to the UK Parliament. When this took place, I found this very interesting, because now misinformation is not just fueling impressionable minds around the world who are using social media, for multiple hours throughout the day, and their risk factor of fake information exposure is much higher, but it's actually made its way into people who are responsible for making political decisions and who are responsible for the next 10, 20, 30 years in protecting our world and its ecology and its habitat and its balance. And so you can really see that fake news and misinformation is having a critical, debilitating impact on the way climate change is understood and the way climate change is being acted upon, not only by individual citizens, but by the people who you would expect to be well aware of the issues enough to take action in benefit of the people that they represent. So what can we do about it? I guess we have to become better at spotting fake news and understanding when misinformation becomes available to us. And we have learned that people aren't actually good at this. In the UK, there was a major study that was conducted by YouGov and The Conversation, which is a news platform. And, the UK is a very mature country, population. The climate debate is very well acknowledged over here, especially after the climate conference that took place in November, COP26 as well. People frequently talk about the intensity of heat waves, floods, other extreme weather events that have started becoming more of public concern than in previous times, and they are attributed to climate change. And in fact, a recent poll just before the UN climate conference found that 80% of people were fairly worried about climate change as an important issue within their own lifetimes. So it is something that is very top of mind. People understand it at a theoretical level, and they conceptually sort of interact with climate change news on a daily basis. So YouGov and The Conversation surveyed more than 1,700 adults living in the UK, and they found that almost half of that sample were unable to correctly identify fake news related to climate change. And almost 44% of people were actually unaware of how often they encountered misinformation on a daily basis in their life. And these numbers suggest that people need more guidance on how to spot fake information, how to spot misinformation, and how to find reliable information about climate change. If you're genuinely interested in learning about something, where do you actually find the information that's required to build that awareness? So I'll share some findings from the study and some statistics, and you will get a sense of how sometimes real fake information and misinformation can sound on climate change. And I would love for you all, everyone on this call, to think about what kind of headlines have you seen in recent past? What kind of climate change related news have you encountered, which now in light of this webinar might cast a question mark in your own mind? Scientists disagree on the cause of climate change, one title read. 44% of people mistakenly believed that this was true. Scientists believe the sun has impacted the Earth's rise in temperature. This was another title. 35% of people incorrectly thought that this was the cause for climate change. The sun has been longer than humans have been around. The sun is not the cause of climate change. Yet people are unable to spot these kind of misinformation in the titles that they read because they are catchy, they're simple, they're quick to understand, and they do a good job at having that ability to share on social media as well. However, people do also understand real news when they see it in light of fake news. So another title read, carbon dioxide levels are tiny, they can't make a difference. 70% of people identified this as fake news. Melting an ice cube in a measuring cup full of water doesn't actually raise the water level, so melting icebergs cannot raise sea levels. This was the title of another article. 68% of people said that this was not true. However, a staggering 32% of people did actually believe it, that it was true. That just because melting an ice cube in a cup full of water doesn't overflow that water glass, similarly, nothing's going to happen to our oceans. There's some more, I can read more statements like these. Another title read, more than 1 million species are out of risk of extinction by climate change. Earth has already had its second warmest year in recorded history. We are good now. The worst impacts of climate change could be irreversible by 2030. Only 55% of people actually recognize this as true news. This is the IPCC findings. that if we do not course correct climate change today, we would be facing the worst possible outcomes, which would be irreversible by 2030. And just 55% of people actually agree with that in terms of spotting fake news or real news. So I really want to make this point and really stress this. And if there's only one thing that you take from this webinar today, please take this. Any climate change news you read from now onwards, read it like an investigative journalist. Look for the evidence. What is the article telling you? What are your own beliefs? Just because it's a well-written article, do not trust it. Just because it comes from a website that is designed like a news website or designed well, or just because your friends and family are sharing it, do not believe it. In fact, there was a very interesting poll, Dr. Durbach, that was done on where people consume media and news and where do they believe it the most. And in fact, 59% of people said that they trust news sources that are shared by their family and friends most than any other source. So that is why fake information, fake news and misinformation spreads so quickly and widely, because on social media, when people share it, they're essentially sharing it with their family and friends. And if there's such a high level of trust that comes with those relationships, you automatically trust the information that is being shared as well. So if there are individuals who, have a habit of reading a news article, but in a very non-critical manner, they're not looking at all of the evidence that is present in those articles, and they're sharing it further, then it's likely that they're having an impact on many more impressionable minds who are actually just, using their own relationship with them as a proxy to trusting the article that is being shared. So this is a big concern, and social media has opened up a big possibility, and the spread of the internet has opened up a big possibility in consuming media like none other. So the two examples that I shared with you, give you a sense of how bizarre some climate change news can be and how quickly it can spread, right? The fact that NASA is saying that climate change occurs because of the Earth's orbit was shared 4.2 million times. The fact that you are seeing raging bushfires in Australia sweep away, decades of growth, and you're blaming it on arson, and that makes it to the British Parliament, that is high cause for concern. And the fact that, international conventions such as the climate change conferences can take place and not a lot can come out of it, since the climate debate has been going on 150 years since, is really cause for alarm. And it really begs the point that people need to be understanding climate change in a much more mature manner on a daily basis and bleed it into their own lives to stir up the activism that is needed to make the politicians do what they are there to do, which is to help save this planet and protect their populations against its worst outcomes. And now I'm going to share with you some tips on what to look for when you are reading an article in your spare time or looking for more information, or as there are many students on this call, when you're researching as well. So tip number one, look at the title. How mature is the title? And when I say mature, I mean, is it an urgent call for action? Does it sound extremely alarming? Or is it well balanced in the way that it's structured? Is it relying overly on influential organizations in order to make you believe that that article is real or not? Like the title that was shared 4.2 million times last year was, NASA admits that climate change occurs because of changes in the Earth's solar orbit and not because of fossil fuels. So you can see in the construction of the title itself, it's made to sound alarming. It's made to sound as though this is a new revelation. It's made to sound as though NASA was at fault and it has admitted to something. And only if you click into this article, you will read a conspiracy. It is made to sound, there's sort of like jargon around sustainability and climate change in that article as well, around SUVs, around fossil fuels, around Earth's solar orbit. So these are sort of phrases which your average reader might not resonate with on a daily basis. So it sounds scientific, it sounds alarming, it sounds urgent. And those are sort of red flags to look out for when you're reading articles around climate change. These are exactly the kind of red flags you should be looking out in your emails as well, with like, the suspicious emails that you get that say, you have only 2 days to claim $50,000 from a bank in Nigeria, for example, right? All of us have seen those kind of articles. And what do? We move them into the junk because we know, I have not inherited millions of dollars in a separate country. And only if I click this link can I access all of that money. So just like how we used to filter suspicious emails and move them to the junk folder, we need to start doing the same thing with suspicious climate change news and move it to the junk folder as well. So that's my number one tip. Look at the title, read it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Really try and understand it and look for these pointers and make a call at that stage. Is this worth your read or not? News channels make money through engagement. What I mean by engagement is the time that you spend on that particular page. Very complex websites, they can tell if someone has clicked into an article, how long are they on that particular page. The higher the amount of time they are on that page, the website understands that this person has read the article. That makes money, that makes higher engagement rates, that increases their advertisement. Do not spend time on articles that you feel are going to be which are going to misinform you on climate change. So title 1. Second, content. Loads of things to look for in content. How well it's written. Are there any grammatical errors? Are there spelling mistakes? A lot of time misinformation, especially around climate change, is written by people who are not from the scientific community, who are not from the sustainability world, who are not well aware of climate change. Look through the article and spot those kinds of errors. Are they making the same kind of assumptions around global warming and weather patterns changing? Are they actually producing a sophisticated argument or a narrative? Are they really trying to share something? Look at what the evidence points are. Where is the article deriving the data that it's using from? Go into the sources. Like any academic researcher, you should be going into the sources and seeing how credible those organizations are, how credible those sources are. The World Information Transfer publishes the World Ecology Report, an influential report, been in circulation, Dr. Durbach, I don't even know, since the 1980s probably, and multiple times throughout the year. Having worked on that ecology report, I know how much of a different relevant sources plays in actually informing a reader on what they need to be knowing. And with the proliferation of fake news, there are lots of sources for everything. Just as you can find a source that claims that climate change is happening because of the sun's orbit. These are not credible sources. Take some time to find out what are the credible institutions around climate change. Look for United Nations, look for the United Nations entities, you look for established organizations, look for the IEA, look for the the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, look at UNFCCC. These are all institutions which are collectively working on this particular topic area. These are your most influential sources when it comes to this information. If you spot an article which doesn't even remotely reference or cite a source that you can recognize, then it's high likelihood that it might be misinformation. In addition to evidence, look at what the point is being made. Is it just finger pointing article, or is it actually raising any kind of awareness? The finger pointing articles are generally conspiracy theories. They don't result in anything, and they're only meant to stir anger in the reader and frustration. Enough frustration that you'll hit the share button and share it with someone else. And as a reader, it works with the millennial population. They feel like they're doing something about it when they share those articles further. It is their way of digital activism in a certain manner. If it is causing frustration, if it is pointing the finger, if it's only an article about the blame game, it's probably misinformation. And then the third and the final thing you need to look at is the conclusion. What is it asking you to do? The article, is it asking you to understand this topic area more and take some kind of political activism? Is it asking you to petition your local leader? Is it asking you to understand what might be the policies around that particular topic area in your country? Is it asking you to sign a petition? Is it asking you to join an organization? What is the call to action? There's always a call to action with climate change news, just because there's so much work to be done and there's a lot that you as a user and a reader can do as well. What is that conclusion? If the conclusion is all that X organization admits their mistake and they're bad, that's misinformation. If all their conclusion is boiling down to the same point that they're making in the content, then it's probably misinformation. And if the conclusion is only to anger you enough to share it further, it's probably misinformation. So keep those 3 pointers in mind. Help us spot misinformation and fake news. There's an ample amount, as you have seen, from this talk on climate change. And we do need to ensure that people understand these topic areas with a lot more maturity. The areas that I feel have really been impacted within the climate debate because of fake news are a few, and some of them are very recent. We know that pandemics are very closely linked to climate change, and it's not too complex. We destroy a lot of forests, we invest a lot of money in deforestation, a lot of furniture, agricultural land, for timber production. We clear out the size of 10 football fields worth of forests every second in the world. So we are destroying habitats at an exponential rate. We're cutting down forests. What happens when you cut down forests? The species that live in those forests come closer in contact with humans, right? It's not like they're just disappearing with the trees. They remain there. And when you have species in closer contact with humans, there's a higher likelihood and chance for viruses to jump from one species to another. They're called zoonotic viruses that come from animals. Like the Ebola virus came from bats, the COVID-19, the coronavirus virus potentially came from pangolins and other species. You have, swine flu that's spread from pigs. There's monkey flu that's recently been making its way around in the UK, which comes from monkeys and chimpanzees, and a whole host of other zoonotic viruses that spread amongst human populations. The amount of misinformation that spread at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, that there is no link between climate change and the pandemic, was absolutely bizarre, illogical and bizarre. In fact, you don't have to do much. You have to go on YouTube, you have to type World Information Transfer, you type Dr. Hardy's name, and you see the webinar. He makes the link as close to anyone can understand at any age group as possible. It's a must watch. I would highly recommend. Jessica, if we're able to put in the link in the chat, that would be great as well from YouTube. So people need to understand that if we continue to if we don't continue to act on climate change, we will see a proliferation of pandemics around the world. There's every scientific evidence backing that fact. And don't let any article that tries to convince you otherwise convince you. Do not believe that pandemics and climate change are not linked. Let's kill it here. Second is around protecting national and international wildlife and marine life through policy reforms, through wildlife corridors, to making protected habitats. We are destroying the biodiversity of our planet. And all of us have studied it. We all studied it in biology and science when we were in high school, that our ecosystem is a balance, right? Right from the tiniest phytoplankton to the most complex human being on the planet, everything exists in a balance. Even the weather, the ecology, the species on this planet. You remove one from the equation and it will cause disturbance across the entire cycle with disastrous impacts, with unmodelable impacts. We cannot sit here right now and even contemplate what would happen or what the world would look like if we were to continue disturbing the biodiversity of our planet. There are multiple articles that say we are abundant when it comes to biodiversity. There's no cause for concern. There's ample resources to be extracted from the ground. And some articles, Dr. Durbach, go as far that if Earth doesn't fulfill our needs, we're going to go out into the space and find another planet like Earth. And that's the kind of misinformation that gets shared across the world. And so please keep a lookout for those topic areas as well.
Thank you very much, Apoorv. That was absolutely a brilliant presentation. I really hope that everybody that listened took very good notes on it. Now I'm going to pass over to our host, Jessica, to ask the questions. We have a lot of them. I don't know how many we'll be able to answer, but Jessica is going to do a very good task on this. Jessica.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Durbach. Thank you, Apoorv, for a very informative discussion and for such great tools to spot misinformation I think we all can use. Our first question is, what category of people is most affected by fake information?
Millennials. Quite simply, they are the ones who are present on most platforms where fake news is rampant. If you look at social media, the millennial population is most active and engaging on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It is their primary source of information and news in today's world. There are very few individuals who were born after the 1980s who actually pay for news subscriptions anymore. I am one of those rare breeds who actually thinks that paying for good journalism makes sense and it's informative. I know Dr. Durbach subscribes to a lot of magazines, physically writing checks and sending them on a monthly basis. But all of those activities actually prevent you from misinformation. They put a barrier around you. But millennials, 52% of them say they rely on social media to get their news briefing every morning. Next question.
Thank you. It certainly seems problematic. Okay, our next question is, what news just about the climate should be posted to maximize the impact on people's minds and motivate them to act?
Can you repeat the first part of that question, Jessica?
Sure. What news just about the climate should be posted to maximize the impact on people's minds and motivate them to act?
How much progress their country is making against the NDCs. The nationally determined contributions set by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are our absolute benchmark on who needs to reduce emissions by how much to keep us under a 1.5 degree world. Beyond, if we increase global temperatures beyond 1.5 degree world, it becomes inhabitable. 250 million people would die of air pollution alone. We would see 4 times as many forest fires. Heat waves across the Middle East and Asia would kill populations. It wouldn't just be bad weather, it would be a death sentence. Crop cycles would change. We would have agricultural irregularities. There would be an increase in sort of rise in ocean levels.
Oceans.
Yes, and populations will move inwards because some parts of the world will become inhabitable. When they move inwards, there'll be higher chances of conflict between populations. We could see threats to peace and security. So carbon is our best bet. Limiting carbon dioxide is our best bet at a peaceful, stable, and livable planet. And the United Nations has done a lot of math and accounting in establishing benchmarks on which country needs to do how much every year to keep within the carbon budget that we have remaining. If every citizen in this world till now does not know where their countries stand, then I think this is a major problem, because we should be the ones who should be pushing our governments at this point to make sure that we comply with those carbon budgets and we do not tip the world over into the zone of inhabitable.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, in your opinion, why do people continue to come up with conspiracy theories and fake news about climate change? Is it a lack of information about climate change, or is it just people's ignorance?
It's money. People make a lot of money off of fake news and misinformation. If a fake news article can generate and become the most widely read climate change story last year, 4.2 million impressions, that is millions of dollars we're talking about. Because the metrics of success for all digital organizations and businesses these days is engagement, and the number of users that come on those websites, the number of users that click those news channels. Advertisers then pay to be part of that website, to have a side panel advertising their products and services, because they know it's driving traffic onto those kind of websites. It's driving traffic onto those kind of pages. And so quite simply, it's money. If I can write 2 articles, one sounding extremely salacious and one sounding boring but true, users are likely to click the most salacious news, and that makes someone very rich.
Right, thank you. And I think a point worth making as well, from my point of view, and some of the work that I've also done on misinformation, is that it seems that, well, according to the research coming out of Harvard, people consume fake news and conspiracy theories because it provides a very simple narrative when they feel out of control in their lives. And I think a point worth noting is why we have, in an age of widespread climate anxiety, it's important to focus, like you said, on what your country is doing to...
Jessica, let's continue with the questions.
All right. More and more people do not trust the news. What is the probability that the media will change the approach and manipulation techniques to hold and attract viewers?
Quite simply, when people, like everyone on this call, will stop reading fake news, when it becomes bad for business, when people become more aware of how to spot fake news, misinformation, don't bother to click on it, don't bother to read it, and denounce it publicly that, oh, look at this news website, it has published a wrong article, naming and shaming. And once you stop engaging with fake information, fake news, you rob away the economics behind those misinformation tactics. So quite simply, we have the power to make that happen.
That's an excellent perspective, Apoorv. Can you list some of the names that are naming and shaming our world that you feel that should be on top of the list?
BBC Fact Checker is an organization and sort of like is part of BBC that fact checks a lot of news that is out there. I know we do a big job. World Information Transfer always, goes after the most science-backed, evidenced, empirical research out there, whereas climate change and human health is concerned. And we don't even sort of, repost anything on our social media or our LinkedIn channels that is not independently verifiable. So I would highly recommend you follow World Information Transfer on all social media platforms if you are looking for up-to-date scientific backed climate related news. In addition to that, the Financial Times does a good job in identifying fake news. I think those would be the top two from the media industry. I don't think large media organizations in the US are great or actually tackle this problem, such as Fox News or large scale media houses. Many a times they have investments within these fake news organizations. And so it goes against their own interests to actually even counteract fake news and misinformation, because it becomes a revenue source.
In your opinion, why do people continue to come up with conspiracy theories and fake news about climate change? Is it the lack of information about climate, or is it the fact that they do not know how to find the correct answers?
Yeah, so I guess both sides, right? So from the media house's perspective, this makes money. People are more likely to read a salacious story than not, and if you can come up with that story from the comfort of your own home and write it without actually going into research behind that story, then even better, less time spent and more reward earned. But from the consumer side, as we were talking about earlier in this webinar, Dr. Durbach, people aren't great at spotting misinformation. It's very easy for them to digest this misinformation and fake news. And people have become very comfortable at accepting these new media channels from where they rely on their from their news briefings as well. Instagram is supposed to be an image sharing website, but people rely on it for their major daily news briefing, such as so as Facebook and many other platforms out there. So I think users and people, will hopefully use this particular webinar to understand how to spot fake news, look at the title, look at the content, look at the conclusion, look at the call to action, and get better.
Another question from the audience. How does fake news affect our consciousness? Why are you harming? Why are they not aware that they are harming the world's population?
I think at an individual level, it numbs people. It is designed to, as Jessica was saying, offer a very simple argument to something more complex. So a user could read Facebook, read fake news and feel like they understand everything. And this is as simple and they're part of the debate. At the national level, fake news can harm a population's knowledge and awareness around a certain topic. And that knowledge and awareness then doesn't translate into effective policies for the country. You have so many countries still who are investing in coal production, coal power plants, indulging in deforestation, and a whole host of issues that are actually harming them more than they are building wealth for them at the international front. And then at the international level, fake news leads to inaction, because it casts a question mark and a doubt in people's minds, which is why 150 years later, we're still debating the accuracy of science on climate change. You could still take a poll around populations around the world and ask them, do you believe in climate change? And you would still hear a majority of people saying no. And I feel those are the kind of ripple effects that misinformation and fake news has at the individual level, at the national level, as well as the international level.
There's one more question before I turn it back to Jessica. Why does the media hide important, relevant news about climate change and its effect on humans?
I don't think media hides relevant news on climate change. It's just that it's hidden behind paywalls. You have to pay for that media. You have to pay for the newspaper that comes to your house. You have to pay for a digital subscription that you can use on your phone, tablet, or computer to actually read those articles. Um, because good journalism costs money in this world, people are not willing to actually pay to read the information that they need. And people have gotten too used to reading the news for free because of all of these social outlets, all of the new channels where you can consume news. It's all out there. It's free. It's unverified. It's unchecked. It's not independently corrected. And I think that is a major consumer problem that is also erupting, whereas the misinformation war is taking place. People are too used to, they'll buy an extra drink, but they won't spend $5 every month to rely on accurate information to inform and heal and nourish their own mind with important information.
Thank you. I'm turning over to Jessica. Jessica, do you have any other questions?
Yes, we do. And if I repeat a question, please forgive me and I'll move to the next. My call dropped. In your opinion, is the creation of a law about fake news necessary to regulate the information space or a basis for manipulation and censorship by authorities?
I think policy plays a key role at curtailing misinformation. I think all of these organizations, like the new tech companies around the world who help spread fake news on their platforms, need to be investing a lot more in new age tools, algorithms to actually find the posters of fake news or curtail its spread. And I think that can only happen if there are policies in place that regulate these kind of actions. There needs to be a higher degree of accountability for the people who indulge in the creation of fake news when it is found. So there is a significant role that regulation can play in actually making this a critical topic area that needs to be course corrected. And sometimes the carrot works, but many a times, let's not forget, the stick also works.
Thank you. Our next question is, mass propaganda is widespread in Russia. Can we influence this? How can we reduce the amount of fake news in Russia?
So with Russia, it gets a little difficult because the fake news is originated from within the country. It is spread by the controllers of the population. It's spread by the government. And it's not independent parties. In fact, one of the first things that Russia did as soon as it launched its illegal invasion into Ukraine was they shut off the internet for majority of in majority of regions across Russia. They just completely shut off the internet. So the populations would have absolutely no way to access independent news, to see what exactly the country was doing in Ukraine and the horrors that it had been inflicting on other populations. And instead, it started sort of recycling and repeating an indoctrination to convince the population that it wasn't actually a war that they were indulging in, but it was sort of, a legal invasion into the Donbas region in Ukraine, which was something that, is something very political. And I think it gets very difficult with Russia because, again, it is the government that's, propagating that information, much like North Korea or any other sort of impugning dictatorships around the world. And the international community needs to deal with this at the highest possible level, because this is elements of mass control. This has elements of psychological manipulation. And these are all, in my head, crimes against humanity. You're robbing people of their fundamental human right to awareness, to education, to discerning right from wrong. And that is sort of mass control at at its most sinister form.
That is a brilliant thought and a wonderful suggestion for our audience, because you're absolutely right. The satellites were showing that Russians were putting arms all around Kyiv and from Belarus, etc. But they were constantly talking only about Donbass, which has a lot of Russians in it. So you're right, but that has been the policy of the communists and since the beginning. Was in order not to be able to bring any truth to the people. Their main focus was to be able to persuade people worldwide that the best world in the world was living in Russia. That's all you needed to know. Of course, when you went there, then you found out that it's completely different. The people are basically poor. They are addicted to alcohol, and they have very, very little information. So I'm so very, very pleased that you were able to come and share your thoughts and knowledge with us. And I hope that we hear from you soon. And Jessica, thank you for hosting. And I hope your puppy is okay. And so have a very good week and take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach and Jessica.